Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to talk about how modern love isn't love. There's going to be a little bit of groundwork I'm going to have to lay in the beginning, so I will ask you to bear with me for just a few minutes, but I'm going to do my best to keep this brief. And I know it's a little funny when I say that, but I do mean it. Now, the term love in English can mean a lot of different meanings. There are four main ones that C.S. Lewis identifies in his excellent book, The Four Loves. These are agape, philos, eros, and storge in Greek. Agape is the love of God, that is generous love. If you've ever seen anything by Bishop Barron, that is willing the good of the other as other in his terminology. I slightly prefer willing the good of the other for his sake. Same idea, just slightly different expression. Storge is the love of the familiar. It's the love of that which is ordered towards its sort of its proper end of growth, especially. It's sort of what makes us like anything, or get used to and feel comfortable with anything that we are used to, anything that's around us normally. It's proper, especially to families, of like parents to children, children to parents, and so on. But it's a love which seeks to order things towards their end of growth, especially. Eros, erotic love, that's the love of man and woman, which, properly speaking, has an end. The two of them unite in order to create new life, to take part in the act of creation. That aspect of it is generally misunderstood, or not understood at all, not understood even as its proper end. And I'll get to why, because that's really sort of the key of what I'm going to be talking about. But there's one other love we need to mention, that is philos, the love of friends. That is the sharing and appreciation of creation between two people, wherein people show each other and unite in appreciating something that is good outside of themselves. And now there's a big confusion because the love of friends is something not well understood in when I say our culture, I'm an American. In the year of our Lord 2019. So I'm talking about this cultural context primarily. It's found pretty widely throughout the world, but by no means universally amongst all people everywhere. Friendship in the sense of love is largely misunderstood. There's sort of a faint shadow of it that tends to get the name of friendship, which is basically just acquaintanceship, more or less. Slight enjoying of each other's company. But friendship in a true sense is a very deep love that a person can have for another, where two people together look on the world. C.S. Lewis, in The Four Loves, mentioned that the classic pose of lovers is face to face and friends shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction. And so that's love in the friendship sense. And the shadow of it is often mistaken for sort of what Eros is supposed to be. Resulting in some odd things where people don't have friends for the most part, and husband and wife are supposed to be their only friends. It yields all sorts of bad consequences. But the point of this stuff is to see where modern love is not love at all. And so what modern love is, to sort of cut to the chase, is need. Modern love is not generous in any sense whatever. Modern love is entirely based upon need. And we can see when we look at this, and I'm going to trace through why in a second. But you can see why it sort of begins with friendship, because friendship is enjoyable. Two people are enjoying something in the world together. And so that becomes sort of this entryway into two people needing each other. And then you find essentially the modern perversion of Eros into essentially just two people glomming onto each other, needing each other. Not two people coming together for the sake of being generous together, for the sake of taking part in creation together, but rather two people coming together, desperately clinging on to each other like two drowning people, hoping that they found a personal flotation device, to use the modern parlance. Anyway, that's sort of what happens. Now, why does this happen? Why is that the concept of modern love? Well, it is this way necessarily, and it's this way necessarily because of people's understanding of what a human being is. Now, there are two basic understandings of what a human being is or can be. that are radically different from each other. One of them, you will not be shocked to learn, is the Christian idea, and the other is very much a secular idea. But it's not uniquely Christian. You can find it certainly in other worldviews. You just need... They are the transcendent self and the immanent self. For a transcendent self, you need something outside of time and space in order to enable there to be a transcendence, something that transcends the moment and exists across moments. So, in the Christian view, there's that transcendent self. There's the soul, which stands outside of the moments of time, connecting them together and making there be a person, a unity, which is within many moments of time. Thus, the self is still the self, from moment to moment. It's the same self which is acting in the world. This, of course, does require God, who is outside of time, in order to create the soul, which is outside of time. The problem when you get to the modern framework, where there is nothing outside of time, and if there was something outside of time, it's a short hop, skip, and a jump by logical necessity over to God. So, within the modern worldview, there is nothing outside of time, and so the self is a purely immanent thing. That is, the self is only moment to moment. This creates a number of real problems, and they're felt rather than thought, because we live in an age, as Chesterton observed, of feelings, not of rationality. But nonetheless, these problems are very much thought. An immanent self, that is to say, the self is nothing but the present state of the body. Well, that's doesn't feel right. I mean, it's wrong, obviously. So there's going to be dissonance between that and perception. How does this get explained? Well, roughly speaking, that if the self is just the current state of the body, then, which I mean by the immanent self, I'm going to refer to this as the immanent self from here on out. It still has memories. It has memories of things that came before. It's not connected to them. Those were different states of matter. Those were different things in a real sense within the conception of the immanent self. Those happen to a different person. But nonetheless, well, here you are and you have these memories. And so what are you? When a person says, who am I? Or, if they even try to go, the Descartes route of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, who is this I that is being talked about? And in the immanent self, there's not very much. It's a very, very thin concept. And about the only thing that there can be, in answer to that question of what am I, who am I, is more or less, and especially in the modern context, which is, again, an emotional context, not a rational one, you are basically your thoughts, your feelings, which is plus or minus to say you are your memories together with your current inclinations. Those are what make you up. And inclinations, things like I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm sad, all of the various desires, I'd like to look at something pretty right now, or I want to play a video game. All of those things I'm classing as, desires. So your personality is made up, roughly speaking, of your inclinations. And then who you are, the content of you, is basically nothing but your memories. This, by the way, is why you can have the modern story, and it makes sense to moderns, of a person being uploaded into a computer. That is to say, the transfer of all of their memories into a computer is somehow them being in the computer. That's why that makes sense to a modern. It makes no sense to transfer your soul into a computer in any sort of real sense. But anyway, just a little illustration of that concept. That's why I bring it up. I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's an illustrative tangent. Okay, so in the immanent self, the problem becomes, roughly speaking, that this isn't anything. A bunch of memories of stuff that happened to basically somebody else. Although you share the same name with them and you look substantially similar and you have similar memories that they do, plus some, and maybe sometimes minus some, and similar inclinations. Well, that's not much. As I said, it's a very thin sort of concept. It's very insubstantial. It doesn't mean anything. It has no independent meaning. As I've talked about many times, people like to say, life has the meaning you give it. That's not worth anything. In practice. I mean, none of them do it, and so on. As my friend Andrew Strutelides likes to point out, if life has the meaning you give it, you can give it the meaning that watching paint dry is the most fascinating thing in the world. It doesn't work. You can't just sit there and watch paint dry and be interested. So, you can't actually give it that meaning. If you can't give it any meaning that you want, the meanings that you can give it are constrained by a nature that is outside of you, and therefore you're not giving it meaning, you're just discovering meaning. Anyway, whether or not a person can think that through, on some level they actually know it, and on some level they intuit that this is not very much. And so they want some sort of affirmation. They want to be real in some sort of sense. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, there's this wonderful image of where all the souls in purgatory are just these sort of like thin little shadows, like grease stains on glass. They're so immaterial. They're not quite nothing, but they're close. And then when they enter into heaven, they become full and real. Or if they stay in hell, they become ever more translucent and almost not there. And only in the dim, dark shadows of a tiny little crevice where the light doesn't yet reach can they look like they're actually made of anything. Great imagery. And it describes fairly well the self, with the feeling of the self within an immanent self, within a worldview that has an immanent self. The self is so immaterial. And so a person seeks some sort of grounding for themselves because they're just sort of this, wash of stuff, kind of like the foam on the sea. It's just bubbling around, but intuitively knows like it's not going to be here very long. The things that you want change over time. I'm not even talking about death. Like, the things that a person in their 40s is interested in tend to be fairly different. There's often some consistency, but they're often fairly different than the things they want as a kid. Like when I was 12, I was certain that as an adult, I would be a falconer. And I'm not saying I definitely won't be, but it's pretty low down on the list. There are a lot more things I'm much more interested in, many of which I just didn't know about at the time. And so, yeah, like you change. Even if you don't die, you're changing. And there's a sense of that the things that you value now, and the sense of those inclinations are, your particular inclinations are going to change. You're not going to remain that same, even if you keep on going. So there's that sense of being this sort of bubbling foam. And so the self wants a grounding. Now, properly speaking, your grounding is in God, who is, transcends time and is permanent, thus you can transcend time too. But if one doesn't believe in God, that's not an option. And so what the heck is there? And well, look around and at least there are other people. And this is kind of interestingly the flip side of Sartre's hell is other people. Because what you refer to the gaze of the other, that when you see another person looking at you, you realize that they're a rational soul. And so, they are a rational being too, rather. And so you realize that you are not God, and thus you are in hell, basically. And that's why hell is other people, because they can look on you and remind you that you're not self-sufficient, and that you're contingent, and that within that worldview, that there's no ground to your contingency, and so you're actually nothing. And so, an accident that just sort of mistakenly happened to be and will eventually fade out is really not much of anything. And so, the flip side of that, though, is the modern desperation, which it calls love, which is the attempt to find some sort of grounding for itself. You're nothing but your memories and your inclinations, and those even will change on you. So what the heck are you? Well, here's the thing. If you can find somebody to know you, this feels vastly more permanent. At least there is something outside of yourself that is aware of you, that knows you. And so the self has some sort of existence and some sort of grounding. It's not very much of one, in fact. It doesn't work. Doesn't work pretty much at all. But desperate people, to quote Jane Austen, are not always wise. And so you have modern love, which is two people basically clinging onto each other, attempting to try to share their experiences and be known by the other in order to find some sort of ground for their being. It's this act of incredible desperation wherein each one is hoping that the other has what neither of them in fact do, because neither of them are God. But a circular argument is two steps longer than than just a conclusion with no argument for it at all, to use a logical metaphor. And so if you don't look very far, a circular argument looks like maybe it's a valid argument. And so two people affirming each other, well, that actually isn't anything. Neither of them actually is the ground for each other. And so I'm just saying over and over again, essentially, that it doesn't work, because it really, really incredibly doesn't. It sort of bears repeating because people are desperate to tell you that this style of need actually does work, will actually make you happy, and this is the path to true happiness, the way out from the dark where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. But no, it isn't. It doesn't actually work. It takes a while for people to actually figure this out, because, of course, anytime somebody is stumbling on thinks they have stumbled on the answer to their problems. They will be elated for a while until it becomes completely unbelievable that this is the answer to their problems. And this is true whether they're in a relationship and they found the one, they're in love, and everything is great, and their life is going to be, roses and happiness, or any number of similar problems. You can find the exact same thing when somebody discovers a new hobby, when somebody finds the perfect piece of equipment for their hobby, when somebody who is really into things like homeopathic medicines finally finds that supplement that's going to fix all of their problems, and they start taking it and they feel better for a while, and then at some point it becomes undeniable that no, life is still kind of going on, has its problems, and then they have to search for the next one. And they will very, very angrily defend the idea that they have actually found the thing that will make their happiness. And they will get very angry at you for telling them that, no, you haven't actually found the thing that's going to make your happiness. This is going to leave you actually worse, because you'll just wasted a whole bunch of time in between now and then thinking that you found it when you haven't. And time is finite, and we all grow older, not younger. And so if you waste time, you're going to have nothing but, to show for it, and you're actually going to have less, because you will have less time on this earth, and you will have built up nothing to use in that interim. The difference, when you look at people who are older, between somebody who spent their youth well, building things, learning, building, doing good for people, building relationships, learning about the world, growing in wisdom, and so on, such that they have, somebody like in their 50s who has spent the first 50 years of their life well, versus somebody who is in their 50s and has just wasted their life on idleness and partying and drunkenness and so on. The difference in happiness between these two people is astounding. But you have to actually talk to people in that age range to actually find out about this stuff, which no one does these days. There's a whole interesting thing there about the churn in things like popular entertainment and so on, who's popular. It's always the younger people who haven't figured out that this doesn't work, and then by the time they do, they're no longer popular. It's a really, really illuminative essay by, what's her name, from A Million Years BC, Raquel Welch, about how the modern world has gone far too far in terms of its sex craziness and so on. And she said, if an aging sex symbol sees this, it's just so obviously true. But here's the thing: by the time she was old enough to see it, by the time she was old enough to recognize that sex, drugs, and rock and roll do not in fact lead to happiness, she was not in the foreground anymore. She had, long since faded, and only a few people know her. And so she, that wisdom falls on deaf ears, or mostly just doesn't even fall on any ears. That's why there's that continual churn. And you see this churn, which also illustrates that issue, that people do not want to hear that their desperation is not going to succeed. But it won't. Anyway, wrapping that up, because I think that nicely brings the topic to a close. That's why modern love is not love. Because it is not any form of gift. It is not any form of appreciation, because love means roughly there are two categories of love. One, gift, two, appreciation. They correspond, roughly speaking, to our two purposes in life. One, to take part with God in creation. Our purpose is given to us by God, obviously. One, to take part with God in creation. Secondary causation, as it's called. Not just giving birth to people, but teaching people and giving them food and so on. Everything we do like that is taking part in creation. The other thing is to appreciate God's goodness. And legitimately as God's goodness as reflected in creation as well. Those are, roughly speaking, our two purposes, and therefore those are roughly the two categories into which you can classify all love, or all actions of love, either way you want to put it. Modern neediness is neither of them. It looks kind of like that second one of trying to appreciate God's goodness in creation, but it really isn't. And if you look at it, that's why it is so desperate and so needy, why it is taken as an absolute need without which a person does not live, a human life. And moreover, why it always fails, because that sort of neediness, the attempt to try to extract from a creature what can only be provided by the creator, that is to say, meaning and a grounding of one's being, is going to inevitably it's poisonous to the relationship, because idolatry is not just bad for the creature doing it, it's harmful to the relationship between the two of them. And if the second one if the object of the idolatry allows it in any way, it's bad for them too. And so that's why modern love that's why modern love is so poisonous, and that's why modern love never works out, because it can't, because it's not love. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at,